lesson as to how this presentation came about. John Houck, who was kind of the godfather of business ethics, died in 1996. I ain't an ethics guy, but one of the things I thought we might want to do is put together Ethics Week in honor of John Houck. We always have it the week of Valentine's Day. And the reason for that is that on Valentine's Day, you get real explicit about saying I love you to somebody you love. So we do Ethics Week that week because we get really explicit about ethics during Ethics Week. Now the guy I'm going to introduce loves four-letter acronyms. Okay? Tom Cosimano, NYSE, we all know what that stands for, okay? New York Stock Exchange. SUNY, State University of New York at Buffalo. Guy's got 3 degrees from there, okay? But now I've got to confess he has a very major character flaw. He's a Mets fan, okay? And what he probably doesn't understand about Mets, and you know what Mets really stands for? My entire team stinks.
Well, Ken and I love company because the misery love company argument applies to us since he's a Cubs fan and I'm a Mets fan. So what I would like to do is give you an idea about how I would address a question that came up in the news through the ideas of Occupy Wall Street, which is the question, okay, are banks too big to exist? Okay? And as a point of view of trying to solve this problem, we want to look at basic issues that come up. And I tried to make sure that I didn't include anything beyond, say, managerial economics. So you should be able to follow this. Now, the overview is a question, is there competition in banking? Okay. The answer to this is, well, if you look at the top 4 banks, especially since the financial crisis, they exhibit monopolistic behavior, which essentially means that they set their prices above marginal cost. Okay. If you look at the next 121 banks, they have what is called monopolistic competitive behavior. They act like, to some extent, like a monopolist, but they also compete with each other. Okay. Now, why is there non-competitive behavior? What we're going to do is we're going to say one of the reasons will turn out to be too big to fail, okay? Which the bureaucrats don't want to use that term anymore, so they call this large, complex financial institutions, okay? But we're talking about too big to fail. And in fact, there's another term that's coming along. They call it financial market utilities. Okay, to talk about like electric power plants where they're utilities and they have monopoly power, but they don't want to use the term too big to fail. Okay, one of the other reasons, and definitely show in the data that there's increasing returns to scale for the production. That essentially is like a power plant. You essentially, if you have a operation that's relatively big, then you have to absorb a large percentage of the market with your operations. And so this could create monopoly power. All right, so what we're also interested in is in terms of ethics issues, well, how is this going to affect the average person? In terms of a borrower, okay, what's going to happen to their loan rates? Essentially, we'll find out that the loan rates would be higher, and then they would pay their depositors lower interest rates. Okay. How does Dodd-Frank try to impact this? Well, there are several provisions to it, but the main thing that's relevant here, and we'll talk about, is that they're indirectly putting in place larger capital requirements, which I'll talk about in detail. And I say indirectly because what the bill said was that the Financial Stability Board, which they created, would adhere to general international standards. And those international standards we'll talk about is called Basel III. And Basel III is associated with larger capital standards. And then they also have this thing called living will, which essentially says how do you orderly dismantle a large financial institution if they're on the verge of bankruptcy in the case of Lehman Brothers. Okay? All right. Now, let's first of all talk about data. And my PhD student, Sebastian, was instrumental in getting most of this data together because it's a huge job to get the data on thousands of banks in the country across a decade of time. The thing that we see, first of all, if we look at, we're going to subset the top 4 banks because those are the ones that appear to be acting in terms of monopolistic behavior. And what you see is their market share has gone from 30% as a fraction of total loans up to about 40%, while the rest of the top 125 have gone up in a similar manner, and so that the two groups together now control roughly 90% of the market. Okay? That doesn't mean that there aren't smaller banks out there. There are smaller banks out there. There's over 7,000 of them, okay? Including First Source Bank, which is a local bank here, okay? But First Source competes against these large banks in the area, but it turns out they're relatively successful in that they control something like 35% of the South Bend market. Okay, so it depends on the circumstances, but that's effectively the degree of concentration that we're talking about in the industry. Now, economists would say that this doesn't necessarily mean that they're behaving monopolistically. Okay, just because there's a possibility that they control a large share of the market doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing something inappropriate. Okay, so in order to address this, what we have to do is get a little bit more detail about what's going on. Now, I didn't know how many people knew the basic setup of banks, so I just quickly listed out the assets and liabilities. If you take my macro courses, you'd be familiar with this. These are the liabilities of the banking system. Transaction deposits are like your checking account. So they're essentially taking your money to the tune of $944 billion, okay? And they borrow it in the form of checking accounts. And then the other thing that they have, you see, is about $5 trillion is in the form of savings and time accounts, okay? The difference there is that you can't directly write a check on a savings or a time account, okay? Now, the rest of the funds are borrowed from other corporations, but this, you see that the main liabilities are coming from the average citizen, okay? And then what's going to happen is they take these funds, and what they're going to do is set aside what they call reserves, which is a liquid source of funds in case you decide to take all your $1 billion out of the bank at once, okay? If you took $1 billion out, they'd have to quickly sell off $1 billion. Well, one way they do that is they have reserves at each of the Federal Reserve banks, and they can immediately write a check for $1 billion against these reserves. So what effectively happens is these back them up. Now, in addition to reserves, they also keep U.S. government securities because they're also very liquid, okay? And so if these start to dissipate, then what they can do is sell off these U.S. government securities. And what's going to happen then is they effectively are going to hold these assets that pay high interest rates, and they're going to be borrowing these assets that pay lower interest rate. The difference is what we call equity, and that's going to be important a little bit when we talk about what's called capital requirements, which is essentially what's the percentage of these assets that are in the form of this equity, okay? And the idea of this equity is that if these assets lose value, like in the case of Lehman Brothers, they were holding mortgage-backed securities, so they lost value. If they lose value, then there's supposed to be enough equity there backing it up, okay? Unfortunately, in Lehman Brothers' case, there wasn't enough equity there, okay? And so now what we want to do is see what's going on. Okay, so the basic idea is the bank accepts deposits and they pay a deposit rate, okay? So that in some sense is their cost of funding in operations, and they invest deposits in assets, okay? And what they're going to do is get a loan rate on those assets, okay? So they charge you as a borrower. Then what's going to happen is if you look at the spread between these rates, generally the loan rate's going to be above the deposit rate, and the spread is going to be used to pay their employees because they got to make sure that these deposits are providing their services. and they have to make sure that these borrowers are able to pay back the loans, and they monitor that. So what effectively happens is you have to have all these employees, and that's going to be paid based on the spread, and what's ever left over is paid out in the form of profits. Okay? All right. So as we go along, any questions that you have, just feel free to raise them because I've got plenty of time. Now, in addition to that, they're required by the FDIC and also, it turns out, indirectly through the Federal Reserve System, to hold equity, which is a percentage of their risky assets. That is their loan portfolio. Okay. Now, you might say, well, didn't they have these requirements before? And the answer is, yes, they did. Okay. Those requirements previously for the United States was they had to have 6% of their risky assets in the form of equity. Okay. And it turns out that they did. Okay. But these are commercial banks. Okay. Commercial bank is somebody that accepts deposits and issues loans. Okay? All the other companies that you heard about that caused the financial collapse are not commercial banks. Okay? They are referred to as shadow banks. And what's going to happen is they do one of these two things. They either accept deposits or issue loans. And because they weren't a commercial bank, then they weren't subject to these regulations. Okay? So one of the things they're going to be doing is these regulation on capital requirements are being broadened to essentially the whole financial system. Okay. All right. Now, let's look at the magnitude of the situation. If we look at total deposits, we can see that the largest four banks are not as dependent on depositors. Okay? They're looking at something else. Okay? If you look at somebody like First Source, they're going to have 70, 80%, okay, of their assets in the form of deposits. Okay? What's going to happen is you look at the Super Four, though, what effectively they're going to do is they're going to be relying on borrowed money. That is something like repo agreements. They can also go into federal funds and purchase federal funds from other banks. In each of these cases, what they have to do is put up collateral for the loans. And generally, they use their U.S. government securities as this collateral. And then if the bank gets in trouble, they can then capture that collateral. Okay? So they essentially have more borrowed funds than somebody like First Source. Now, if you look at total loans and securities, you also see that one of the other banks will have a smaller, a larger percentage of loans. And if you also then look at their equity relative risk-weighted assets, remember I said before the crisis the requirement was 6%? And you can see that they basically were meeting those requirements all along. Okay? They hold more than what was required. Okay? So they did lose large substantial funds, but effectively what happens is there was this buffer there. And as the financial crisis developed, they became more and more conservative, adding more and more equity. Okay? And this actually is one of the reasons why you hear these stories about the fact that banks aren't lending to people. Okay? One of the reasons why they're not lending to people is that these capital requirements are becoming more stringent. And if they're holding more capital, then they have less to lend out. Okay? All right. Now, if we then look at their income side, you see their interest income for the biggest banks is bigger. Okay? So what effectively happens is they have larger interest income, and the rest of the 121, 125 have lower interest income. But the interest expense for the largest banks is bigger. Okay? One of the reasons why the interest expense is bigger is because they're relying on borrowed funds. And borrowed funds are going to be more expensive than checking accounts. Okay? For example, right now we get almost nothing on our checking account, while the borrowed fund rate would probably be about 0.5%. Okay? So what's going to happen is the interest expense is generally going to be bigger for the banks that rely on borrowed funds. And notice that non-interest expense really is not a part of the story. They basically both behave relatively the same. Okay, right? And then what we have is what's called the net interest margin. That's basically the spread between loan rates and deposit rates. And you can see that the spread is smaller for the big banks. Okay. All right. So this is the managerial economics part. We'll essentially show you what this means. Basically, if we look at the marginal cost of funding, for now, just think of this as the cost of deposits. Okay, and I'll talk a little bit more detail about this later on, make it more realistic. But for now, this is the cost of deposits. Okay, there may also be some resource costs like the non-interest expenses that we talked about. That would be the employees, tellers, the bank's branches, and so on. So we have this marginal cost. And now what's going to happen is if we were in a competitive environment, what we would do is we see this demand curve. But the demand curve is going to be the demand curve for loans, not deposits, right? Because the bank is providing loans to individuals. And so what's going to happen is if the loan rate goes down, then what's going to happen is we got a bigger demand. Okay? Now, what's going to happen is if we have a perfectly competitive industry, then we should go basically to this point, in simple terms, where price is equal to marginal cost. Okay? And so the only difference between the loan rate and the deposit rate should be the non-interest expenses plus any economic profits, the normal rate of return on profits. Okay? Now, what effectively happens, though, is if we have a non-competitive environment, say, let's look at a pure monopolist, then what's going to happen is we'd have marginal revenue equal to marginal cost is the best place to be. And we would be at the point A. And if that's where we maximize our profits, we go down here, we know this is the amount of loans we issue. And then if we go up to our demand curve, this tells us our price. But in the case of the bank, the price of loans is going to be the loan rate. Okay? So now what happens is we'd like to know, well, what happens if we lower marginal cost? Okay, a good example of that would be in 2008, the Federal Reserve brought down interest rates in general. So that's going to bring down the deposit rate. Okay? As that occurs, the marginal cost comes down. If we're in a competitive environment, in the long term, we're going to move to here. Okay? We're going to go from here to here. And the change in the loan rate is basically going to be similar to the change in the deposit rate. So what's going to happen is the lower cost of deposits are passed along to the customers in the terms of lower loan rate. Okay, now, what happens in the case of a monopolist, though, is we'd go to the point D. Okay? And now what's going to happen is if we go to the point D, then the loan rate is going to be lower, as in the case of the competitive environment, but they're not going to go down as much. Okay? And in fact, what happens is they're going to compare this gain. See, because they've lowered the loan rate, they're going to gain the share of the market. Okay? And as a result, what's going to happen is they're going to make profit on that. On the other hand, they're going to lose this amount. Okay? And they're losing that amount because these old customers used to get this loan rate. Now, if you have adjustable rate mortgage loans, these rates will drop. Okay? And so what will happen is you lose this, but you gain this. What this trade-off is based on the slope of your demand curve, or they call it the elasticity of demand in your courses. Okay? So what effectively is going to happen, though, is you have this drop in the loan rate, but the drop in the loan rate isn't going to be of the same magnitude as the change in marginal cost. Okay? So what's going to happen is if the deposit cost of operations go down, the bank's going to take part of it in the form of higher profits. Okay? And what's going to happen is we're not going to get as many loans being issued. Okay? So that's what's going to happen if we have monopoly power. Okay? So that's a quick overview of microeconomics. Is there any, as applied to banks, are there any questions or things that come up with this before we go on? Then we can start addressing the question that we wanted to know. Is there monopoly power in the banking industry? And then how does that affect too big to fail? Okay. All right. So this is coming from Sebastian's paper. And what he did is he did what's called in industrial organization an H-test. And basically what you do is you statistically look at what happens if your marginal cost of operations change. Okay? And based on the previous diagram, what you see is if I see marginal cost drop, I should see a corresponding drop in the price. Okay? And in fact, I want that ratio to be roughly 1 to 1. Okay? So what effectively we do is we run a statistical test to see whether or not that's the case. And if it's 1, then we're in a perfectly competitive environment. Okay? And if it's less than 1, then we're getting closer and closer to a monopolist. Okay? And what we find out is, first of all, the blue line here is for, again, the super 4. Okay? By the way, you may not remember this, but on the first slide, we had those listed: Citibank, Chase, or J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo, okay, are the 4. And what effectively happens is you can see that they were actually more competitive than everybody else up until the financial crisis. But since the financial crisis, they've actually become more a monopolist, closer to a monopolist. And in fact, we now are in the circumstances where we cannot reject H statistic of 0, which is a perfectly monopolistic circumstances. Now, what effectively we've got then is essentially evidence of monopoly power. Okay? And how that affects people is essentially the loan rate isn't going to be as low. There's not going to be as many loans available. Okay? And as a result, this is going to affect how much building that's going to occur in the country, because all these loans are being used in order to fund new equipment and plants for businesses, for houses for individuals. So this is going to restrict the lending that's occurring, okay, and affect society in general. Okay, so this is essentially what we observe. Okay, so the next question is, why is there monopoly power? Okay, one case that we think of is utility industry, like a big power plant. And if a big power plant is serves a market the size of South Bend, then the idea of having 2 power plants serving the same industry same area would be difficult. Okay, and so there may be only one firm that serves the whole market. Okay, so one possibility is economies of scale. Okay, and what effectively we find is that, in fact, there is now evidence of increasing returns to scale, or what we call economies of scale. And this is actually something surprising, because when I was in school, studying banking and everything, at that time it almost was never feasible to find economies of scale. Okay, but this is more recent work coming out by people at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. And what effectively they do is they show evidence of economies of scale. Okay? And one thing that happens is, if we look at the top 4, they have $415 billion cost to manage $7.5 trillion worth of assets. Okay? So they're managing assets that are about 2/3 of the whole economy. Okay? GDP, gross domestic products, is somewhere around 13-14 trillion. Okay? So this is a big percentage of real GDP. Now, suppose we look at the experiment where the government decides that they don't want these banks to be too big. Okay? Maybe because of too big to fail, we want to break them up. Okay? Well, what we could do is break them up into 8 different institutions. So we have the 4, we break them up, each have less than 1,000 worth of assets. And if we did that, what would happen is we'd have an increase in cost that's roughly $79 billion, okay? Which is 19% of this cost of operations. Okay? So you can see that there is substantial cost of economies of scale. Okay? And what effectively happens is this cost actually is larger than the combined profits in each of these years. Okay? So I guess I should have said each of these years. So this $79 billion would exceed the profits in each year. Okay? So what effectively happens is society would incur a cost if they were to break these firms up. Okay? So it's not clear to us whether or not it's a good idea to break the firms up. There is the cost where the loan rate would be higher because of monopoly behavior, and there would be less loans. Okay? Okay? But on the other hand, we have this where we have economies of scale. And so we're lowering costs because of operations. Yeah?
Is the loan rate amongst the big four firms still lower than it is amongst the other 125?
Well, if you look at, going back to earlier slide, I think it's the interest income is bigger among the top four. Okay, so you can't really get a loan rate because there's so many different assets. So what we do is we take all interest income and divide it relative to the amount of loans and securities. Okay, and that is bigger for the top four. Okay?
Their bank accounts, or who they're getting loans from the big ones into the smaller ones, if they're running monopoly?
Well, that would be one suggestion that you would have. Okay? If, in fact, you end up with the conclusion that they are too big to exist, the easiest way for us to vote is essentially just to take our money out of the top four banks. Okay? And in fact, if they are in general having a higher loan rate, okay, you essentially could get a lower loan rate by shopping around. On the other hand, if you look at the deposit rates would be suppressed because of monopoly power. So by shopping around, you could raise your deposit rate. So it's in some sense a win-win situation if you're an average consumer. But this is suggesting that there's something going on that makes it profitable for people to stay there. Okay? In other words, maybe there's something else going on. Okay? But we're not exactly sure. But notice that one of the things that was going on is that the big banks are heavily dependent on borrowed money. Okay? And that's going to become crucial in a little bit. Okay? So this raises the question then, what do we do with economies of scale? Okay? Or why are there economies of scale? Okay. Now, this is a paper. I partially believe this, and I'm not, okay, except I think it's a little bit too big, so I'm still studying this in detail. But I came across this study by one of the people we were interviewing for a job a couple weeks ago named Gandhi. And what effectively happens is they examine the 630 banks listed on the major stock exchanges in the country. And that's using what's called CRSP data, Center for Research and Security Prices. And SIC code 60 are community banks. Okay? Now this 630 banks would include our 125. They also would include First Source. Okay? But it wouldn't include over 7,000 other banks. Okay? The really small banks. But those really small banks, the community banks, control about 10% of the market. Okay? So this is one group that we're thinking about. Okay, so it's not really small banks versus the large banks. It's the large banks versus intermediate-sized banks. Okay, and what they did was they broke the returns of these banks up into 10 different buckets, and starting from small banks up to the largest banks. Okay, and we got 10 different buckets. So on average, that would be maybe like 63 banks, except they didn't do it in terms of number of banks. They did it in terms of market value of the company. And then they also made adjustments for standard things that we think is important for determining the expected return on stocks, such as whether or not a company's big or small, whether or not it's a growth or a value firm. Okay? So after making all those adjustments, you still have an 8% lower rate of return for the largest firms, the largest banks. Okay? So from finance arguments, what this would tell you is that big banks in general are safer. Okay? That is, the only reason to think of a lower rate of return is you get lower rates of return on things like bonds because you got a more certain payment coming on. So in this case, what's happening is you get this lower rate of return, 8% lower return, by holding equity in the big banks. And this is even excluding the financial crisis period, just looking before the financial crisis period. So what effectively happens is this is something that is puzzling. Why would that be the case? Okay? And that then gets us back to our main topic. What makes banks safer? Okay? Well, too big to fail, okay, is a key ingredient to this. Okay? If you're too big to fail, what you do is you reduce your downside risk. Okay? You're going to get the normal ups and downs, but effectively what you've done is you remove the extreme cases where the company fails. Okay? So although Citibank has been through rocky times, they're still around, and so your shareholders still are going to get a positive rate of return. So what effectively happens is we have this downside risk is removed, and now they estimated that given the lower return in market value of equity, they estimate that the subsidy coming from too big to fail would be $26 billion per year. Okay? And that was only for 3 of the banks. They didn't, for some reason, they didn't have JP Morgan in the sample or brought out. But if you include them, you would end up with 45% of the economies of scale that we showed you. Okay? So 45% could be associated with too big to fail because essentially the banks are no longer taking on the risk of the bad circumstances. It's the U.S. government that's taking on the risk of the bad circumstances. And by the fact that you voted those people into office, U.S. taxpayers are the ones that are taking down the downside risk. Okay? Now, the other question then is where possibly could you get, where did the other half go? Okay? Now, remember that the large banks are heavily dependent on borrowed funds, not deposits. Okay? The reason why that's crucial is because deposits are insured by the federal government, okay, through what we call Federal Deposit Insurance Company. Okay? FDIC insurance has been around and was developed in response to the Great Depression. So that now if a bank fails, then what happens is if you have less than $250,000 in your account at that bank, then what happens is you're not going to lose any of that $250,000. What effectively happens is if there's a shortfall, the shortfall is made up by the FDIC insurance fund. Okay? So you as a depositor basically aren't being affected if there is a change. Okay? So that's one of the reasons why they have low cost of operations, low interest rates. Okay. Now, as we saw though, the top four banks, they're more relying on borrowed funds, which are not deposits. Because they're not deposits, they're not subject to the FDIC insurance. Okay? So if you were to undertake a repo agreement with Bank of America, okay, what effectively happens is you got to take the risk that Bank of America is going to fail. Now, what effectively happens is that's why they use repo agreements. Okay? They use repo agreements so that you have collateral, and if the bank fails, then what happens is you can take the collateral associated with the loan. Okay? But repo agreements don't work in financial crisis because that's what Lehman Brothers was doing. Lehman Brothers were, okay, their repo agreements were based on mortgage-backed securities. And now what happens is as you go through a financial crisis, the mortgage-backed securities start to lose value. as they lose value, what effectively happens is the borrower, the lender to Lehman Brothers say, oh, these are too risky. So what's going to happen is instead of being able to buy 95% against the mortgages, they may only be able to borrow 50% against the mortgages. Well, that creates a shortfall of funds for Lehman Brothers. Lehman Brothers then looks at the circumstances and say, we got to sell off assets. What they have are mortgage-backed securities. They sell them off. The price of mortgage-backed securities go down. Okay? That's how we spiraled then into the financial crisis, okay, in 2008. Okay? So what effectively happens is, okay, if you have borrowed money, that's risky funds if the equity of the company disappears. Okay? Now, once the equity disappears, who makes up the difference? It's not the depositors, okay? It's the people that are borrowing funds. So what effectively we have then is borrowed funds are safer because of too big to fail, okay? Because they're if you're a commercial bank and you're told if you fail, you can't fail, then what effectively happens is the depositor, the borrower doesn't have to worry about the downside risk, okay? And as a result, you've got safer assets, and so you're willing to borrow from the big companies at lower interest rates, okay? All right, or lend to the big companies at lower interest rates. Okay, so that's another part of what we have. Now, how are we doing so far? I should raise any questions that you have at this point, because that essentially is the basic ideas, and if that's okay, then I can talk about regulations and things of that nature, but that's the basic idea of where the banking system is. Okay, any things that you can think of? Okay, all right, so what happens then is somebody has to regulate a utility, okay? And in this particular case, the reason why they became a utility was because of FDIC insurance. Because if effectively the banks fail, then FDIC is the one that's going to make up the difference. So as an insurance company, what you want to do is you want to charge insurance premiums, okay, which they do. And those insurance premiums should be tied to the deposits, okay, and the riskiness of the loans that the banks issue. The issue, though, is that deposit insurance is not tied to the riskiness of the company. It's basically a percentage of your deposits, okay? So that's one issue, and it turns out that, okay, Dodd-Frank never talks about this, okay, and introduces the idea of putting in insurance schemes that would help solve the problem. Okay. One thing it does do is it essentially pays more attention to effective regulation by the companies like FDIC, the government agency like FDIC and the Federal Reserve System. Okay. And what they did was they created this new group, okay? And like all groups, once you want to, in Washington, act like you're doing something, what you do is you create a czar, okay? And that czar basically is this group. It's called the Financial Stability Oversight Council, okay? And they call it FSIC, FSOC. Now, Financial Stability Oversight Council basically is the old regulators of the banking system, okay? It's the U.S. Treasury, the Office of Currency, the FDIC, the Federal Reserve System, and the SEC, and so on. Anybody that could have a hand in regulating the financial system has been put on this board, and there's 10 of them. And they're essentially responsible for setting up the regulations. And Dodd-Frank basically didn't do much in terms of regulations except tell us that this board is going to establish those regulations. Okay? All right. And now, what happens, though, is in that Dodd-Frank, they have provisions that said that those regulations will be consistent with international regulations. Okay? And independent of Dodd-Frank, there has been detailed discussion in summits occurring between the G20, and that has led to what's called Basel III, which is the international regulation of commercial banks, or for that matter, financial institutions. Now, these regulations imply or require minimum capital, minimum common equity that should, and they call that Tier 1, and that minimum common equity should be 4.5%, is what they start out with. Remember, equity is the buffer if the company gets into trouble. And if you read stories about Lehman Brothers, they had, less than 3%. Okay, and because of accounting schemes, they even had less than that. Okay, how am I doing on time? I don't have a watch here. Okay, okay, I guess about 10 minutes off. So what I'm going to have to do is just tell you a little bit about this, and then we can talk about these in detail if you want. Okay, so what it does is not only increases this requirement, but it tightens what it means to be capital, and basically means that equity actually has to have ownership being the last backstop. Okay, so effectively the way a layperson would think of equity is the way they're going to try to do this. And they're getting rid of some things like goodwill, holding of other financial institution, and something called deferred tax assets. Okay? Now, in addition to this 4.5%, this is kind of weird. They, instead of putting it at 7%, they said, we're going to create a conservation buffer of 2.5%. Okay? Why didn't they just say 7%? I don't know, but they put it in 2 stages. So effectively, what they're doing is the regulation on this equity is going to be 7%. Okay? Now, in addition to that, they designate a national authority. Well, because of Dodd-Frank, that's that Financial Oversight Board, has additional authority when people see asset bubbles. Okay? Whether or not you can define what an asset bubble is. If there is a process of excessive demand for loans occurring in the country and prices are skyrocketing, things of that nature, then what happens is this designated authority can monitor credit conditions and add additional capital requirements. Those additional capital requirements can be as much as 2.5% more, which brings it up to 9.5%. Okay? The basic idea is if they think there's excessive credit growth, what you do is you increase the amount of equity so that it curtails the amount of lending that occurs. Okay? And now the next thing it does is it introduces regulations for these large, complex financial institutions. And what they're going to do is they look at them and they look at the type of operations they're doing. And based on the possible outflow of funds in a given time period, notice statistically, if they think that 4% of their equity could disappear within a month, then they better have that additional 4% for the possible loss of equity. Okay? So the too big to fail are going to have new increases in capital, and that possibly could increase it another third. Okay? So effectively, the regulations are the increased capital requirements. Okay? This is where it's phased in. This is basically the bureaucratic details. Essentially, starting at the end of this year, January 1st, 2013, they're phasing these in by 2018. Okay? Well, given the time, basically, I just want to sum up. Okay, we saw that there was monopoly power, okay, to some extent. What effectively happens is one of the things that we also saw was that banks were safer if they were too big to fail, okay? And that gave a subsidy to the large banks, okay? So the questions that you have to do is address, well, one, do we regulate these institutions? In other words, we figure out a way of restricting what they're doing, okay? Or do we figure out a way of getting them to disappear, okay? Now, if they're serious about these capital requirements, I would suspect that this is a way in which you're creating economic incentives for them to dissipate, okay? Because of fact, if you look at these large, complex financial institutions, if they have to have more capital requirements, then that's going to increase their loan rates, okay? In research that I've done with people at the IMF, what we found out was that if you raise the percentage by 1%, then what happens is, in general, the largest 100 banks in the country would raise their loan rates by about 12 basis points, okay? So each time you tack on another percent to the common equity ratio, what you're doing is raising the loan rates that those banks are going to charge, okay? Now, if you're not too big to fail, that creates incentives, okay, for the customers to go to the banks that are not too big to fail, right? Because if they're not large, complex institutions, they're not going to be subject to these extra capital requirements, and so what will happen is they have a lower loan rate, okay? And now what we have then is essentially like a tax on being big, okay? And if you're too big, then what effectively happens is you're going to have to pay this price, okay? Because you have to pay this price, then what happens is it creates incentives for you to break up, okay? And that's the basics of what I've thought about, okay? All right, so I didn't answer the question. I gave you all kinds of things to think about, what you should think about, okay? But there's cost and benefit, so we can open up the discussion now for the last 15 minutes or so. Yeah.
You say the market capital portfolio return is 8% lower for large firms. You say like 8%, like they're between 17% and 9%?
Yes. Okay. And that's not for larger, it's the larger banks. So they're comparing the small banks with the large banks and looking at those differences in rates of return. Now, one thing you may say, well, why is 16 basis point change in the loan rate generating such a big change in the return on equity? And what you got to do is realize that there's this equity multiplier there, because what happens is they're only putting up 10% of their own equity to run this massive institution, okay? So what effectively happens is a bank will on average have maybe a 1% return on assets. But if that's going to be multiplied by 10 to get your return on equity. So a small change in the return on assets can give you a big change in the return on assets, return on equity. Okay, yeah.
Does the new regulations really do anything to try and encourage them to not engage in such high-risk activities? Because, I mean, the capital requirements really won't do anything if they're losing money, like, say, on the mortgage-backed securities that they kind of got in love with and then fell apart.
Yes.
So, like, I mean, shouldn't they be trying to do something to incentivize, not necessarily, like, just increasing the capital requirements? Because, I mean, those will go, like, they'll lose all their capital when they're losing money, and instead try and encourage less risky behavior.
Okay. Yeah, there are provisions like that. Actually, there always has been provisions of the nature. If you are a commercial bank, then you have to have your books examined by experts at either the FDIC or the control of the currency, and they essentially make sure that certain rules are followed, that you're essentially lending to relatively safe individuals, that you're not putting too much of your assets into one category. Those type of things always existed. One of the things that they're doing is they did put in this thing called the Volcker rule, that said that if you were dealing with trading activity, then what effectively happened is you had to have different capital requirements. And in some sense, that's the additional capital requirements that I was talking about on the large financial institutions, too big to fail institutions. Okay? So they are doing aspects of that. I was just focused on the capital requirements today. Were there other questions over here? Yeah, Brian.
What would you do? You could kind of ask us a lot of questions. You think Dodd-Frank got it right?
Well, I think most experts in banking would say the first thing is you do is you set up the FDIC like an insurance company. Okay? And what you do is if you had insurance premium, say on your house, what effectively happens is if your house is more dangerous, they raise your insurance premium. Okay? And in fact, if you're not close enough to a fire hydrant, they won't even give you insurance. Okay? So one of the things that most people would argue would be deposit insurance basically is poorly defined right now. What effectively happens is if deposit insurance was established, it should be established such that the premium that's charged should be tied to the riskiness of the ventures that are being undertaken. Okay? So that what effectively happens is if you are dealing with a bank that is riskier, then what effectively happens is you're going to end up with a smaller deposit rate. Okay? And then you have incentives to just leave that bank, go someplace else. Okay? So I would use price mechanisms to deal with these issues. Okay? So, and I think this is ethics issues. Okay, the original sin of banking is FDIC and deposit insurance, as far as I'm concerned. And so that's the heart of what you should be dealing with. Other questions? As far as I know, nobody's made any suggestion in government regulations to do things like that. Yeah.
Riskiness of a particular bank.
Pardon?
How hard is it to actually measure the riskiness? I mean, wouldn't it become very sort of political and whatnot? I mean, you would have to have some sort of very objective standards and
Yes.
evaluators. That
Well,
would work.
There are technical problems with that, but there are experts like myself that study those problems and essentially looking at the statistical properties of assets. Based on those statistical properties of assets, we can assess the probability of losing a certain amount on those assets. And so we can generate ways to measure those type of things. They're not perfect. One of the big problems with it, like in the case of the financial crisis, the models didn't account for what's called correlated risk. Nobody thought about the idea where all mortgages would drop together. Okay, they thought, well, maybe one part of the country could lose value, but the idea that all mortgages throughout the country would lose value, nobody ever considered that in their models of the economy. That's why everybody thought that they were relatively safe. So it's not perfect, okay, but there are ways of measuring those type of things. And that's what the bank examiners look at. Okay. Other questions?
I'm going to have to change my METS thing, okay? We all go to banks, we all use them, okay? So Tom's really METS, as my entire topic is significant.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.